Kristen Smith here, and I am going to be continuing my review of the Punisher series with episode 9 called Front Toward Enemy. Now, this episode messed with me. It was, great, but also just, oh my gosh. Well, shit, really? This episode is basically where everything just goes crazy. So, we finally find out what Lewis's goal was this entire season. And or we kind of found out at the end of the last episode. I didn't mention it in my review, but a bomb goes off near where Madani lives. Inaccurate. It's Frank is on a roof. It goes off near Frank, but he's checking on Madani. So I'm kind of correct, but I'm also kind of wrong. So anyway, this bomb goes off, and what we learn is that Lewis is setting these off, and he thinks that he's connected to Frank. He thinks that he's someone who is fighting for the same things that Frank is fighting for. You know, that he's a freedom fighter, that he's someone who is protecting the rights of the nation, but in reality he's a terrorist. And this is something that Frank brings up in the episode. It's also a great justification for this show, because a lot of people will criticize this show for being unnecessary violent, or for, you know, the vigilantism, but they do set up this distinction that Frank does what he does against people who are criminals and who are, actively hurting other people, while Lewis is doing things and hurting civilians. Now, Frank tries with everything he has to not hurt anyone who he deems as innocent. And for the most part, we would also think that the people that he believes are evil are evil. Not, and this is all to say that, you know, this is something that's obviously not correct, but it's a great way for them to set up this distinction so that they can point to this, for people who do criticize this show for what its message is, and that there is, you know, they're obviously not encouraging other people to violence, uh, based on, you know, this contentions that they've set up between these two characters. Moving on from that, Madani really is struggling with the loss of Sam. She's trying to get out of going to his funeral. End of the day, she decides to go to Sam's funeral. And I'm jumping around. I'm going to go character by character because there's so much in this episode that I want to unpack. But she eventually decides to go to Sam's funeral. But on the way, she stops for a drink. And this is when her and Micro meet for the first time. Now, this is near the end of the episode, so there's a lot that happens in between. But for Madani and Micro, this is their story, you know, where she is basically catatonic. She is just out of it, completely out of it. You know, she gets a pep talk from her mother, she gets pep talks from other people, decides that there's nothing she can do about this, and she has to take responsibility for Sam's death. She goes to the funeral, she meets Micro at the bar. Micro at this point is doing what Frank said to do. Maybe not at the right time, but Frank did agree that they need to bring Madani in on this. We'll see some of this probably show up later, but at this point, you know, this is what they want for what they're doing. And this is really cool. I think this is where the partnership between these people starts up. At least, you know, I hope that's what it means. And it's really interesting that, you know, we're starting to realize. I didn't know where I was going with that. Okay, so there's definitely a partnership in the works here, and once Frank is okay with how this took place and with Madani working with them, it will be really interesting when they all realize, you know, what Russo is doing and that he's super involved in this, because they all have dealt with Russo or have some sort of connection to him, and so it'll be really cool to see this partnership go up against Russo. Now, Russo is in charge of the senator's protection, who is a target of Lewis's, and another target of Lewis's is Karen Page, who is coming into play in this show in ways that I didn't expect. And that's really good. This this is obviously giving Frank more motivation to take Lewis down because Karen is someone who is important to him. And if you mess with people that are important to Frank Castle, usually you end up dead. So this is clear motivation for him to just go crazy at at Lewis. And another thing, Frank doesn't need any more motivation at this point, but he gets more because Lewis ends up actually capturing Curtis, who goes to try and stop him. Well, Frank finds Curtis, and he's got just a ton of explosives strapped to him. Him and Lewis have this conversation, and they basically talk about their own experiences. They talk about the fact that Curtis doesn't belong where he is right then. He doesn't belong strapped to all these bombs. It's counterintuitive to what Lewis is trying to do. Curtis is not the enemy. And Frank doesn't believe that Lewis is, in the right at all, but he'll do anything he can to save his friend, and that's just his code. And he basically risks his life trying to save Curtis. Lewis tells Frank, which wire to cut after a very long conversation. They have a very small moment of connection where Lewis begins to trust Frank, at least at face value. Frank cuts the wire, gets Curtis out of there, and hopefully Curtis will make it out of this episode because he's very badly beaten. But on top of telling Frank what wire to cut, Lewis also called the cops. Now, this was basically to set Frank up in a catch-22 where he can either stay and help his friend and get caught by the cops or flee and be safe, and then Curtis will die with, I'm assuming, the rest of the cops as well. So obviously he chooses his friend over his freedom. Now, once the cops show up, it's a completely different story because Frank has to run away from them, and it turns out that Frank is caught on one of their cameras. And so now the whole world knows that he's alive, and they're convinced that he's connected to these terrorist attacks. I'm assuming that within the next episode, after you get, testimony from Curtis, also, there are people who heard Lewis's voice on phone. There's people who have seen his handwriting, and those same people are people that have heard Frank's voice and have seen Frank's handwriting, like Karen Page, and they can testify as well that Frank is not involved in this. So hopefully this will all blow over. I'm really, I really don't want Frank to be considered a terrorist because it will just, I don't know. I feel like it'll just bog down what he has to do because he has to take Lewis down. And there's 3 episodes after this, and there is no way that Lewis is surviving past the next episode because he still has to take out Rollins and Russo. He doesn't even know Russo is evil yet. So there is a lot of stuff that has to happen in the next 3 episodes. He has to team up with Madani still. There's going to be something that happens with David's family. There is a lot of stuff that's going on, and I don't think we are anywhere close to, this end game. But Lewis's storyline, I think, is going to get wrapped up within the next episode. I think it's just got to happen. So, I really loved this episode. It was a little bit of a step back. We didn't get a lot of backstory, but we did see what Lewis's endgame was. So in that respect, we did understand more about his character. We do also have kind of the setup for how this endgame is going to happen, where obviously there's going to be something involving Lewis, and that's going to involve other people as well, including Karen and Frank. So and now that Frank's out in the open, we're obviously getting towards the end game, and they think they're setting it up very well because I can't tell what's going to happen, but I know it's coming. So obviously, I'm just still really impressed. This was not one of my favorite episodes, but at the same time, that's still, it's because all the other episodes so far have been so good that this one just feels like it's setting things up as opposed to some of the other episodes. But I still really love it. So let me know what you guys thought of this episode in the comments. You can find my playlist with the rest of my Punisher reviews right on over there. You can also subscribe to my channel right on over here. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.